everybody, welcome back to my channel, The Eclectic Reader. So today I would like to talk about what I have been reading in the past week and also my experience writing. So as you may know, or if you're new here, hi, I'm a PhD student in French and I am currently working on my dissertation or thesis. So I also want to talk about my experience writing. But first, let's talk about what I've been reading. So the first book that I read and that I've actually completed is The Borrowers by Mary Norton. The Borrowers is a children's book that was published in the early 1950s, 52 in the UK and then 53 in the US. It's the first in a series about these very tiny creatures who live in humans' houses, human beings as they call them. The tiny creatures are called borrowers. And the borrowers borrow, or rather steal objects from the human beings to furnish their homes so that they might make food, basically to survive. They live almost parasitically off of humans, but they don't see what they're doing as stealing because they define stealing differently. As Arietti, who is the child in the clock borrower's family, says, stealing is taking things from another borrower, not from a human being, because borrowers need human beings for survival. So in some ways, I kind of think about it as humans needing animals for survival. They don't see what they're doing as taking or killing. Obviously, that depends on who you speak to. But that's the way that the borrowers think about what they're doing. The borrowers borrow things from the human beings, but they cannot be seen. If they are seen, they are forced to emigrate because the human beings will try to destroy them. Pod, who is the father in the clock family, he has to sneak in, avoid Aunt Sophie, great Aunt Sophie, as well as the gardener, the servants, and this 10-year-old boy whom he only vaguely knows exists without being seen. But one day, Arietti discovers this 10-year-old boy and not only is seen by him, but speaks to him. And the story follows what happens from there. This book is simple in some ways, so I would say definitely early readers would enjoy reading this book. But in other ways, it's actually quite challenging. There's a lot of vocabulary about running a household that even I wasn't familiar with. I think these are some outdated terms for sewing, mending, words like that. I don't think it's very crucial for understanding the story, but I was surprised by how much vocabulary isn't really used anymore. And in that way, it is a book of its time. It deals with domestic issues. Not exclusively, but I think that that domestic theme is of the 50s. There is also some latent imperialism in it because the boy, as we learn in the beginning through the frame narrative, he grew up in India, but he returned briefly to live with his great Aunt Sophie because he was ill and so he was in recovery. Unfortunately, he died during World War I in the trenches, and his sister is the one telling her niece about what her brother had told her about the borrowers. So that's the frame narrative. The frame narrative is this woman who's telling her niece about what her brother had told her about the borrowers when he was living in England with his great Aunt Sophie. That's the frame narrative. But most of the story we're following the borrowers. I enjoyed it very much. I know some people think that it's boring, but I didn't find it boring at all. I thought it was very interesting also to see what children were reading in the 1950s. So I do recommend The Borrowers. Now I want to talk about two books that I am in the midst of. One I hope to finish this weekend, and that's The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. The Color of Law is about housing segregation in the United States, and Richard Rothstein's thesis, which he backs up with an incredible amount of data, is that the federal government, and particularly the courts, are behind housing segregation, and that they allowed for housing segregation to occur. They endorsed it, in fact. In doing so, he's arguing that this wasn't just individual racism. It wasn't just individual white people who didn't want black people living in their communities, but that the laws were such that black people, for example, couldn't get mortgages because the FHA, which was the Federal Housing Association, would not insure their mortgages. And so banks wouldn't give them mortgages. And just how at every step of the way, the federal government was involved in making sure that Black people were segregated and living separately from white people in worse homes, allowed for these subprime mortgage lenders to prey upon African Americans. I think that this is a very, very important book, and one that should be read alongside The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, which is one of my favorite nonfiction books that I've read and deals with the war on drugs. And again, how the war on drugs began in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Act as a way of getting around the law that had just been passed. All the various strategies that he discusses here were ways of getting around the 14th Amendment. I think this is a very, very important book, and I hope to finish it this weekend, so I'll be talking more about it once I've finished it. And then I'm also reading, and I need to cover the library sticker, A Wolf for a Spell, which is a children's book. It was published in 2020. It's by Kara Sutton, and I will show you some of the illustrations in a cutaway. So this book, A Wolf for a Spell, is loosely based off of the Russian folk lore about Baba Yaga. There's 3 different points of view here. There's the point of view of a young girl. Her name is Nadia. She is an orphan. And then also the point of view of Zima, who is a wolf pup, and the point of view of Baba Yaga. At the moment, we have been introduced mostly to Nadia and Zima, who feel out of place. They are being asked to conform to a certain ideal, and they're not living up to that. And they also have different desires and interests. And so this is, I imagine, a typical coming-of-age story. I'm loving this book so far. It is just a fantastic read, and I also hope that I'll be able to finish this in the next few days. Now about my writing. So I wanted to talk about academic writing and my experience with it. So academic writing has always been something that I struggle with, and just writing in general has been something that I struggle with. My writing is very clear, but it takes me a long time to write. And I used to always think of writing as something I had to do at the very end, after I had all of my ideas just clearly set out in front of me. But actually, I found that writing is much more enjoyable when I am writing along the way. I also find that writing is a way of thinking, something that I've discovered in the last few days, that in the process of writing, in the process of explaining my argument, I discover the holes that are in my argument. I discover when I'm saying something that actually doesn't fit with what I have been saying before. I find that maybe I'm interpreting data incorrectly. And yes, that can lead to a moment of crisis, but I feel like if I start writing earlier than later, I can deal with that crisis with less anxiety than if I were having to quickly write something the last few weeks of the month before it's due, and then suddenly I discover that, oh, what I thought I was arguing isn't what I'm arguing, or I thought I would be saying this, but the data is actually showing something different. And that causes me a great crisis. So I feel like I'm actually enjoying writing for the first time, precisely because I'm finding writing to be a way of thinking through what I am reading and making connections. And those are the parts of research that I love the most. So I'm actually having, for the first time maybe, a positive experience with writing. Though I do have some deadlines coming up. I do have an outline for a second chapter coming up in the next few weeks, as well as a second draft of my first chapter to submit to the rest of my committee. So I'm hoping that that works out. So anyway, that is what I've been reading and writing. I would love to know what you have been reading. Are there things that you've really been enjoying? Or maybe books that you haven't found to be as interesting as you thought they would be. Thank you everybody for watching, and I will talk to you later. Bye now.